Hi, I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about chapter 17 and 18 in Decker's text, Reading Koine Greek. Both these chapters are with the aorist. The aorist was introduced in chapter 7. We read at the start of the chapter that the aorist, based on what you saw in chapter 7, simply refers to a situation in summary. It is what I'd call the default tense for giving commands, for narrations, and so we'll be using the aorist quite a bit during the BLC second semester. Chapter 13 talked about verbal aspect, and that's one of the big things over the last 30 years as far as scholarship in New Testament Greek, so we want to talk about that just a little bit as well. Now, I watched John Kerr's video over chapter 7, and I kind of agree with him. The aorist is the default tense. In fact, some of the first commands that you received in BLC are aorist imperatives. Now, from a grammar translation method, usually you don't look at imperative verbs until quite a bit late in the year. In fact, in this text, at chapter 29. But the very first imperatives that you learned, you see some listed there, anastethi, kathison, elthe, porevu, are all aorist imperatives. That just reiterates that the aorist is kind of a default tense. The aorist tense in the indicative usually indicates past tense. Now, that kind of overlaps with the verbal aspect stuff. Not everybody is in agreement, but personally I believe, not so my friend Rodney Decker, may he rest in peace. We're going to talk about RIP in a little bit. I believe the presence of the augment indicates past tense, usually. Now, there are about 15% of the aorist imperative verbs in the New Testament that are not past time referring, and so if you take my position about the morphologizing aspect to the presence of the augment that indicates past tense, then I'm going to have to come up with some way to explain that. But the aorist tense in the indicative usually indicates past tense. Aorist does not mean past tense. In fact, the word itself means undefined or unbounded. And there have been a lot of weird things been said over the years about the aorist, and so just try to stay mainline with me and avoid some of that weird stuff. Now, I did not watch John's introductory video over chapter 13, but verbal aspect is one of the big things that's happened in New Testament Greek scholarship over the last 30 years or so. At least since 1989. My own Greek professor, who later became my colleague, never mentioned it whatsoever. He kind of got stuck in the 1970s, early 1980s. I owe a lot to him, but I've done quite a bit study beyond what he gave me. In fact, last week I was speaking to John Kerr, and he told me that he never heard about verbal aspect when he was a student at Ozark. And when he went to grad school at Wheaton, he kind of had an old school professor for Greek, and he never heard about that either. So he was happy to see the emphasis in Decker. Now, there's not widespread agreement about verbal aspect and actually whether there is tense at all. But there is widespread agreement that the Greek verbal system is aspect dominant rather than tense dominant. English would be a tense dominant language, and so let me just say that you don't have to understand it. You don't really have to remember it to do well in this course. But if you want to learn Greek well, at least be aware that it is a conversation. Now, in chapter 13, Decker does give us this nice little chart, section 13.11, where you can see the different tense forms in Greek and the aspect that goes along with that. So perfective aspect, we'll see the aorist tense form. Imperfective, we see the present and imperfect tense forms. I just checked Decker, and we start with chapter 17. You studied the imperfect tense in Decker chapter 16. And then there's a third aspect, stative aspect, where we would find the perfect and pluperfect tense forms. Now, since you're graduate students and you have access to Perlego, I just want to make a commercial for this book, a little book published by Zondervan, Basics of Verbal Aspect in Biblical Greek by Constantine Campbell. It's only 154 pages. Probably the first 4 chapters or so are gold if you want to understand this conversation and the disagreements and the agreements about Greek verbal aspect. And so I know that you don't have anything whatsoever to read, and so I want to make you aware that that's there and you can have access to it and read it. It may help you in your understanding of what we're going to be doing in the BLC course as we go forward. But let's move to chapter 17. Basically, you can check this paradigm. What I've done is I've just copied this chart in there. What I want to bring to your attention is that the first aorist active indicative starts with an augment. And see in the chart where you've got the different forms, you can see I've highlighted the augment, the epsilon, with blue. Also, the tense formative, actually, Decker will use the term form marker for the first aorist is a sigma alpha, and so I've kind of highlighted those. And so we've got the augment followed by the aorist stem for the verb luo, it's just lu. And then we've got the form marker, the sigma alpha, and personal endings. Now, from a grammar translation method, as I have taught this for years and years and years, basically that third column there where you see the form marker plus the personal endings, I've had students just memorize that sa, se, with a movable nu many times, samin, sate, san. And so that should work well for you. The aorist middle indicative luo, once again, you'll see highlighted in blue, you've got the epsilon, which is the augment, then you've got the stem, and you've got the sigma alpha form marker. And so the endings would be sa, main, so. If you want to know why it's so instead of sa, you can read the little note at the bottom of that little chart in your text. Samen so sato, samethe saste sando. And then when we have contract verbs, those would be verbs whose stem ends in a vowel that's either epsilon, omicron, or alpha. Generally what happens with those verbs is that contract vowel will be lengthened before we add the sigma alpha and our endings. And so the first aorist of agapao is egapesa, where that alpha right before the sa is lengthened to an eta. You can see how that works. Zeteo becomes ezetesa, pleroo becomes epleroso. Okay, and so you'll pay attention to that. Square stops, you encountered this for the first time talking about first declension. There are consonants that when you add a sigma to it, there are changes. And so be aware of that. The first aorist of vlepo is eblepsa, but the psa is not p sigma alpha. When the p is joined by a sigma, it converts into psi. The bottom line on that little chart we would call dentals, the tau, delta, theta. And when you've got a zeta, that works the same way. And so I added at the bottom of the screen that you can see there, baptizo, you've got the augment, ebaptize, add the sa, and the zeta will drop out just as if it were a tau, delta, or theta, because the zeta functions kind of like a dz anyway. So be aware of some of those changes. Homonyms, okay, an important idea, a homonym. And this is listed in Decker's text as advanced information. But a homonym in Greek would be a word that has a different lexical meaning in the active and in the middle. There are two principal verbs in the New Testament that function this way, and we've seen both of them. The verb apto in the active voice means to light or to kindle. In the middle voice, aptome, it's a helping verb that has the idea of begin. And so from BLC first semester, you saw that oaner aptite trechin. The man is beginning to run. And then archo means I rule. In the active voice, I just said that wrong. Okay. Archete trechin. Archo in the middle means begin. Apto in the middle, aptome means to touch. And so in the BLC stuff, I'm sorry I messed up on that. Forgive me. That's one of my 10,000 errors during the semester. The father had this snotty little kid who wanted to grab a hold of the knife, and the father would say, me apse. That's the middle voice of that, saying, do not touch. Aorist passive indicative, we've got a different form marker. Decker is going to emphasize the theta. You can see the endings that he gives, ein, eis, amen, ete, esan, which are endings that you've already seen before. I kind of like to think about the aorist passive and put the theta and the eta together. And so, once again, you've got the augment marked in blue there. And so our endings from the top to the bottom with the theta eta, which is our form marker, would be thein, thes, the, themen, thete, thesan. Some advanced information. Now, regarding voice, we've got active, we've got middle, and we've got passive in the aorist. Whereas in the present tense, you only have an active and a middle passive. So we've got three separate forms in the aorist. This is advanced information about theta, eta, middle forms. Probably the best thing to understand is that you should not view these points, active, middle, passive, as definite set points along a line, but you should understand this as a continuum. And so sometimes we'll have theta, eta forms that are passive by form, but that behave more like a middle. And so the part that I highlighted of the text there that's in pink, when the context or meaning of the word makes it clear that passive voice makes no sense, we call the form a theta, eta middle. Now, I want to bring to your attention this, a book published in 2016, The Greek Verb Revisited. You do not have access to that in Perlego. But basically, chapter 18 out of that text, written by Rachel Aubrey, who's a Wycliffe Bible translator missionary, wrote this chapter. It's called Motivated Categories, Middle Voice, and Passive Morphology. And basically, she provides 55 pages worth of data to reveal that what Decker said in the previous slide was correct. I have my advanced students at Ozark actually read from this book. I just want you to know that it's there. Okay, chapter 18 on the second aorist. Once again, the concept was introduced by John in his video introducing chapter 7. Some examples in English, the present tense, I teach. In the past tense, it is not I teached, but rather we have a stem or a form change, and the past tense of teach is taught. So that's kind of an analogy on what happens with certain verbs in Greek that do not have a first aorist form, but rather have a second aorist form. Example of some words that were erchome. We know this word in the present tense. In the past tense, it has a second aorist, and it is eilthon. Okay? Very, very common second aorist form. The aorist imperative of this word is one that you have already seen in BLC, elthe. Now, I'll just comment so that you will know that the eta of eilthon, the aorist active, becomes shortened into an epsilon in the imperative. So the eta actually is the augment in the aorist indicative form of erchomai. Imperatives do not have augments. The only verbs that have augments are indicative pastime verbs.